making a vocal sit well in a mix is not just about mixing decisions. It starts with the performance itself.
You tend to think that your voice doesn't sound good in higher places because you have some sort of, you just hate your voice.
I want to give you the why behind those decisions and the general principles, and that I hope I can explain it, or we can explain it in a way that makes sense to you, so you can then intentionally apply whatever works for your song and whatever you want to do with the vocal. And most people, honestly, in rock and pop, don't compress vocals hard enough. I hear this all the time when I critique mixes. People are not bold enough.
Automation is the best thing ever.
Yeah, it is. Just talk about your traumatic experience with S's, Manel.
This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go.
I am hearing this all the time. In fact, it is one of the most common problems that people keep running into, and it is, my vocals never seem to sit right. They are buried in the mix, and when I turn them up, they all are way too loud all of a sudden, right? And I want them to be more in the mix, but still clear and audible all the time. Or I want them to be up front, but not on top of the mix too much. Like, what do? I hear this all the time. People are struggling with making vocals sit well in the mix. So let's do an episode on this. The vocal is arguably one of the most important elements in most mixes. So I don't think that we really have to explain why that matters so much to get it right. But, maybe give you some ideas as to how to make that work. And the vocal is, unless you're in some kind of very special genre, it is probably what connects most with your listeners. It gets the message across, it tells the story. It's the most unique thing about your music because it's the one thing that will sound like nothing else. So even if you copy everything else and you use the same gear and whatever, the one thing that will be different is your voice. So it's very important to make sure that it does its job and it gets the emotion across, gets the story across, the message, and just works. And part of that is making it sit well in the mix, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So if you're new to the show, welcome. My name is Benedikt Hein. I'm the host of this show. If you're looking to make exciting sounding records from your home studio or jam space, you're in the right place. If you're already a listener and you're coming back to us, again, thanks so much. We always appreciate you. And as always, I'm not doing this by myself here. I'm joined by Manel Espinosa Berenguer from Spain. Hello, my friend. How are you?
Hello, Benedikt. I'm happy as always. And yes, just in case you don't know, I'm Manel Espinosa, and I'm a music producer and mixing engineer from Spain. Always happy to work on artist songs and make them as good as I possibly can.
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't go super fluid today, but
yeah, me neither. I even forgot to tell people what I do. So I'm a producer as well. I used to be. I'm now a full-time mixing engineer. I mix hundreds of songs every year from my studio here. And both Manel and I together have helped a lot of artists and transformed their demos into finished releases and have made many, many records. And everything we've learned in the process of doing that, we are sharing on this podcast and our whole platform, the selfrecordingband.com, where you can apply for coaching, work with us in many different ways. So yeah, welcome. All right, Manel, I'm kind of disappointed you put on your superhero cape there, like the shirt that you just put on right before we started recording, because
why?
You were looking so like I still have my gym clothes on today because I just got back here from working out, okay. And you just looked like you did the same, and I was like, look at him. He's like, we're in like sporty mode today. No, now you're in beach mode, which I also enjoy.
Yeah.
So if you're listening to this on a podcast app, it makes no sense to you. But I just said, just go to YouTube and watch the YouTube version of it, and then you can see Manel and his summer vibes on his shirt.
Yeah. By the way, I should mention that I can't wait to go with you to a silent gym again.
Which is just a normal gym in Germany, but apparently Spanish gyms are louder, or the people in Spanish gyms. Manel calls our gyms the silent gyms. Yeah. But the one we've been to together was really silent, I have to agree. Yeah, can't wait to do that. I want to go to a noisy gym with you in Spain at some point. I want to experience that. Like, I imagine people yelling and, throwing things around. Yep.
Yeah, especially the music is kind of loud.
Yeah. All right, good. Anything to add to that before we get to the episode? I think we already lost a couple of people, as we always do with the banter.
Yeah,
but
no, I don't want to annoy people more. So,
okay, cool.
I mean, please excuse me for this the previous comment.
No, that's totally fine. All right, vocals. So the things I want to cover here today are a couple of different ones. I want to talk about a few mixing techniques, of course. That is part of making a vocal sit well in the mix, as you would have imagined. But there are some things, as almost always, that have nothing to do with the mix and that people often overlook when it comes to these things that I also want to talk about. So let's start with the first one. I think that, or I'm convinced, that making a vocal sit well in a mix is not just about mixing decisions. It starts with the performance itself, as always. So if a vocal if it just doesn't feel right in terms of timing and pitch, it will never really sit right in the mix. It will always sound off, and it will not connect well and be glued together well with the music. And even if it is in time, and even if you hit the right notes, doing it in a different way can make it sit better or worse in the mix too. Like, that goes back to the episodes we did on timing and intonation, so you should probably listen to those. You can make a song feel a lot different by, you picking a different key or playing around with the timing of things, and just getting those things right is really, really important. And I always do this when I work with artists at the studio. I don't get to record as much as I did, but when I do, and when I did it in the studio a lot, I would always try a few different, like whenever I felt like somehow this doesn't sit well, I would always try a couple of different ways of, different ways in terms of timing, maybe also changing the melody, or like doing something to the line itself. And sometimes, more often than not, we've come up with something better, and all of a sudden the vocal line becomes part of the mix, where before it was this weird thing on top of it that never really worked well. It's hard to describe, but it's worth playing around with that. It's like one example that I just have in mind is when, and that's going to be the only one that I talk about here, because it's very hard to explain. It always depends on the context and everything. But for example, assuming that the timing is correct and it's not just bad, which is always a bad thing. But let's say you have a verse that's going, or a part that's going into a chorus, and there's a little break on 4, and then the chorus starts. You could be like, and there's like one word in this break, in the transition. It feels completely different, and it can sit well or not, depending on how you do it. So, for example, you can have 1, 2, 3 word chorus, or you can have 1, 2, 3 word chorus. Like depending on where you put that, both are correct, but the entry of the chorus feels completely different, and the vocal can feel like a part of the music that drives things forward, or it can feel like something you just put in there that doesn't really do anything. And it's totally, I just want to say that it matters. And if your vocals don't sit right, make sure that stuff is correct before you go to mixing techniques. That's my long monologue on this topic. And Manel, you produce a lot, and you work with artists in the studio and help them turn the demos into songs. So I'm sure you put a lot of emphasis on that, and like make sure that the vocal lines and the timing and all that is right first.
Yeah, of course. And I think another important thing is what comes before and what comes after, and especially the relationship between the different elements. Because let's not forget that the vocals are very important, but are just one element on a song, which consists of a lot of different elements, right? So if you have, guitars or strings or whatever elements that are fighting, so to speak, with the vocals, that's gonna make our job more difficult, right? Some of those things we can maybe solve them in the mix, but I think that should be the last possibility or whatever. Before that, we could try things like, I don't know, if you have a guitar that's, you feel it's fighting with the vocals, and you can check that out with a EQ analyzer, maybe then play in a lower part of the guitar, and you make more space for the vocals to shine. So I feel that's super important before even getting into mixing and trying to fix those things with EQ or whatever.
Very good point. I didn't even have that on my outline, but the arrangement and things clashing is a big one. Yeah, you will always fight an uphill battle if it's an arrangement problem and not a mixing problem. 100%. Yeah. And it's not just about clashing in the same frequency areas and these things. It can also be just many different things asking for attention. Basically, if you have too many focal points, right? If it's just very busy and every or many different parts are trying to be the star of the part, this can be intentional and you create chaos basically like that. But if the goal is to serve the vocal, maybe, like not everything can be super interesting and the focal point all the time. And sometimes other things are grabbing our attention and it just distracts from the vocal and it makes, the vocal is suffering because of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say that in some cases, we tend to start with the vocal as the most important thing. So, of course, we want the singer to sing the song in the best range for him or her as possible, and then we build the other things around it, right? So on one hand, I think, depending on how experienced the singer is, but as we talked in the pitch episode, sometimes we can try to sort of push things, right? And try to find new registers or more difficult registers because we want to transmit different feelings, right?
Yeah.
Because what happens, at least what I've seen sometimes,
Yeah.
and it also happens to me when I like before getting into singing lessons, you find this place which normally tends to be quite low, where you are super comfortable because you like your voice, it feels cozy, whatever, especially if you're making not super energetic music, right?
Yeah.
So, and you sing in that register all the time because it sounds good for you, whatever.
Yeah.
But that's really, really difficult to make it stand out on a loud mix
Yeah.
because you just cannot you cannot sing loud in that register because it's too low. And you think, because you haven't or you haven't taken singing lessons or vocal lessons, whatever,
Yeah.
you think that you cannot reach higher places. And you tend to think that your voice doesn't sound good in higher places because you have some sort of, you just hate your voice, right?
Yep.
So, yeah.
Like, go on. I have a question, but like, go on. Yeah.
Yeah, just if you are there or if you see that the singer is there, try to convince him to go to vocal lessons because that will open up lots of avenues and new sounds and new registers so that he'll be able to basically make his or her vocals sit in the mix just because of the register, because of his or her singing.
Yeah. Is it possible that there is a real story behind what you just said?
Yeah, a couple. Like, firstly, there's my story.
Yeah.
Which it happened to me that before going to vocal lessons, I tended to have this lower kind of singing like this. And it worked because we had a successful song that I did with that voice. So I thought like, oh, I have to do this all the time, But it was a ballad, so it made sense. But I couldn't, whenever I went up, I felt uncomfortable for whatever reason. But then I went to vocal lessons, and that opened up a whole new world for me because my teacher basically pushed me to sing stuff like Iron Maiden, stuff like that, which is crazy difficult. And also that happens when I work with other artists, that they get super confident in one register because they released a song that sort of or worked to some extent, and they tend to hate any other registers they might have. And if you go to vocal lessons for a while and you get a good vocal teacher, you'll see that with practice you can make it happen. I mean, I'm not gonna tell you that you're gonna be Bruce Dickinson, because that's not realistic.
Yeah.
But you'll be able to like control your voice in many or more different ways, and you'll have more alternatives, right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, totally. And so to sum it up, there is the perspective of like, where does your voice sound the best, and does it match the energy of the song? Like, can we get the excitement and all that out in a loud mix, for example? Does it sound intimate enough in a quiet mix? Can we do both? Can we do a transition from one to the other or whatever, like those things? Then obviously the timing and pitch has to just be not wrong, like just not bad. And then if you found your range and all of those things, then are there a couple of different options you can explore? Are there things clashing with the vocal? Is there anything fighting for attention? So yeah, that's great. And with all of that out of the way, the result is probably going to be a vocal recording that is mix ready and can actually be, turned into something that sits well in the mix and gets the emotion and message across.
Yeah.
Cool. Yep. I love all of that. That's very, very good. Also good that you shared your own kind of story there as well, because it's not something where we talk down at people and be like, yeah, you all do it wrong and we know exactly what to do. Like when we record our own stuff, we run into these same things also. And, it's sometimes even harder because you don't have the objective perspective and no one to push you to do better, right? When you have a producer with you, they can tell you, hey, maybe we should go up half a step, or maybe you should push some more at the end of this, or we should do this or that in terms of timing. It's super hard to do when you're on your own. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think, the good thing that we both have is that we've been artists before being producers or mixers or whatever. So we've been through basically all the different experiences that artists tend to go through. And we can learn from them. Oh my God. We can we can learn from them and also help people with our experience. And that's the beauty of it. Like we were not born with a word producer in our foreheads. That's something that happened over time because, life led us to that.
Yeah, I'm very lucky that I wasn't born like that. Very happy. So now let's talk about those mixing or technical things, like engineering and mixing things, though, because that's part of it as well, of course, and super important, and that's what a lot of people struggle with too. So let's start with EQ. And I want to break it down into different individual steps, because usually it's a combination of all of them, but I want to talk about the individual parts of it. And there's a reason for why in this episode we don't have any audio examples, just because I try to come up with some, but the thing is, there is no one way that you should do this, or no one size fits all. And if I tell you to make this vocal sit in the mix, you turn down this frequency and you add this kind of effect or whatever, and then you recreate that on your song, and it will completely not work because it's so different from song to song. So instead, I want to give you the why behind those decisions and the general principles, and that I hope I can explain it, or we can explain it in a way that makes sense to you, so you can then intentionally apply whatever works for your song and whatever you want to do with the vocal. So let's start with EQ. Let's think about what makes something sound close to you and near, and what makes something sound further away, because that is one of the first things you think about when you position a vocal in a mix. Like, does it need to be on top of the mix and very close and upfront and direct sounding, or should it be more embedded, more pushed into the mix a little further back? Or do we have different vocal layers where there's some depth between them, and one might be more upfront and the others might be behind them? So let's think about that in terms of EQ. When someone is really close to you, singing or talking directly into your ear, what do you hear? You hear a lot of the mouth noises, the details, the S's, the T's, the consonants, all that stuff. So that is top end. What you also hear is the body of the voice. It sounds full and close to you. When someone moves further away, you hear less details. It's a little washy. The transients are not as clear, and it sounds thinner. And so If you EQ your vocal in a way that it is very crisp and bright and clear at the top and it has a full body, what you get is a really upfront, close-sounding vocal. The extreme example would be something like a podcast voice, or even way more extreme, like a commercial voiceover, the deep, low, crazy compressed, larger than life sounding vocal type thing. If you put that in a mix, you can turn it down really low and it will still stick out and sound close, sort of, if you do some other things too, but just in terms of EQ. If you do the opposite and you tame the top end and you make the body of the voice a little thinner, it will sound a little more distant and not as close and upfront. It will become part of the mix more, and you can play around with the amount of detail to make it sit exactly where you want it to be. You can think about what the hi-hats and the drums or the percussion is sounding like, or the transients on an acoustic guitar, and whether you want the vocals to be even more percussive and detailed or less than that, or on the same level, or you can play around with that. Just think about what it is in terms of frequency that makes a vocal stand out or be part of the mix and be pushed back some more. And then there are some more extreme things you can do, like if you really crank the mid-range of a vocal and you make it kind of honky and really, mid-range forward, it will also become pretty upfront, and it can be kind of harsh also. But this is also something that can make a vocal stand out of the mix some more if you just push mid-range. But just be careful with that, and also depending on where you push, to not make it sound really unnatural unless that's intentional. But with EQ, you can position a vocal in the mix, and sometimes it's not a volume thing, sometimes it's an EQ thing. Sometimes if you think it's too loud and then you turn it down and then it's buried, maybe the EQ is just not right, and that's why you're not able to find a good spot for it in the mix. So, I don't know, do you have anything to add to the EQ topic, Manel?
Not really. I would also think about EQ again in terms of the other elements. Like sometimes if you want to make the vocals stand out, maybe it's about taking out some stuff from other elements, like whatever it is, guitars, strings, if you have high strings or whatever.
I love how you always kind of invert what I say, which is absolutely it's really cool, because you always think about the other perspective and the stuff that I haven't thought about. It's right. It's not just about EQing the vocal, it's about EQing everything else so that there's space for the vocal, because if that is not the case, you will have to bend the vocal so much that it becomes unnatural or sounds weird. And since the vocal is the most important thing, maybe other things should suffer a little bit and not the vocal. Something's got to give. And maybe it's a good idea to make something else less bright so you don't have to make the vocals crazy bright, or whatever. Yeah, absolutely agreed with that.
You are the yin and I'm the yang.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. That's exactly why I brought you onto this podcast, Manel. That's awesome. Great. Cool. Next thing is compression. Again, if we think about what compression is and what it does, I love how, do you know the Attack and Release show? This other podcast? No. I don't know if it's still around, but it has been a really great podcast. I think it's still out there. I just don't know if they do new episodes again. It's one of the hosts, Sam Moses, is a great mastering engineer, and I really love this podcast. It's about mastering, but it's a great podcast in general for anyone interested in audio music production. And I always remember Sam Moses explains compression and limiting sometimes as like the result of compressing and limiting something is more loud more often. So the quiet stuff in your music or in your vocal gets louder if you compress it hard, and you have more loud things happening more often, and there's less tiny quiet little details that can get buried in the mix. Because what happens when you compress is you turn the loudest stuff down, and this depends how far, and all that depends on how you set the compressor. But basically, you turn up the loudest stuff down, then you bring up the overall volume to compensate, and voila, all of a sudden the quiet stuff is louder than before. And so, if you do that, if you think about it, that means that quiet words, parts of words, syllables, consonants, stuff like that, breaths, details in the voice, they are now louder than they were before, and so they're more audible, and so the vocal doesn't get lost as much in the mix. So the harder you compress something, the easier it is to make it stay on top of the mix. Yes, compression can have negative side effects. It can distort unintentionally. It can pump if you set it the wrong way. It can make things smaller also because you have less dynamic range and it's kind of narrowed and squashed. But that can be a very good thing when it comes to vocals. And most people, honestly, in rock and pop, don't compress vocals hard enough. I hear this all the time when I critique mixes. People are not bold enough. They hear someone say, don't compress more than 5 dBs or whatever bullshit they're saying. And like the reality is people squash vocals a lot all the time because it makes it, first of all, it makes it much less raw and demo-y sounding, and we just kind of like that obviously finished kind of sound. It brings it closer to you. It brings out the details. It can make it much more exciting, less boring. It can make it thicker. It can all these things. And so people don't compress vocals enough. And I would highly encourage everyone to go really hard on compression, overdo it intentionally, and then dial it back a bit and find whatever sweet spot there is for your song. And of course, it's going to be a difference between a ballad and a death metal song, but still, most people don't compress enough. And the thing is that if you compress vocals quite a bit, you can again make it quieter in the mix, but still hear everything. So the vocal can become part of the arrangement and doesn't sit on top of the mix, but you still hear the details. You still hear every single word and every part of every word and the breaths in between, and it just becomes part of it. Whereas if the vocal is very dynamic and you find a volume for it, then some parts will stick out and others will be buried, and it's impossible to find a really good spot. So I would rather, and if I'm worried about dynamics or making it too boring or too flat or overcompressing, I would much rather compress really hard and then bring the dynamics back manually with volume automation than not compressing hard enough. And that's what a lot of engineers do. They will really squash a vocal and then just ride the fader with the music to make sure that it is as dynamic as it needs to be. Because you can absolutely have lows and low moments and high moments in terms of volume, and you should have. But you can do that then intentionally, and you're not at the mercy of whatever the singer did when they performed. And so compression is a big part. And also, if you think about why compression was invented in the first place, or there's many reasons, but some of the reasons why compressors were invented and what they've been used for. If you think about radio broadcast, if stuff on the radio wouldn't be compressed like crazy, people wouldn't be able to listen to their favorite songs in the car while it's noisy around them, right? And not everyone is listening in a quiet environment on a hi-fi system. So if you do that, of course, you can listen to jazz and classical music that's super dynamic and all that because it's quiet and you have a great stereo system. But if you're in your car listening to the radio, or you're doing the dishes and the radio's in the background somewhere, or whatever, if things are not compressed, half of the content of the music will get lost. You just won't hear it. And so that's one of the reasons why music started being compressed in the first place. And if you think about that same concept, think about your music, the instruments, as kind of the quote-unquote background noise, and the vocal is the one thing that needs to stand out all the time without being crazy loud. And one way to do that is compressing it. So I know that there's differences in genres and all that, of course, but again, most people don't do it enough, and everyone has still, of course, different approaches to it as well. You can also say, well, in terms of instead of compressing a lot, I could also automate a lot and bring up all the tiny, quiet stuff manually. So I wonder about your process there, how you handle the dynamics of a vocal, Manel, because fact is that vocals, without doing anything, they are too dynamic for most pop and rock songs. So you got to do something about it.
Well, one of the, I think, most valuable things I've learned from you is to prevent all these situations. Know from the very beginning, what are we going for, right? Who is the singer? How does this person normally sings? How does she, in my case, how does she pronounce the S's? the eternal thing in our revisions, the S's.
We're gonna get to that. Yeah.
And like how you position the microphone to evade excessive S's and stuff like that. And I'm saying that because later on, when you want to apply compression, that's gonna play a big part. Like if you have prevented the S's problem before, then when you compress it like crazy, it's not gonna be as problematic. So yeah, I think that being prepared is key for everything we do here, basically. But in this case, is quite important. And yeah, for me, like I guess it depends on the song, right? Like sometimes I like to compress like crazy because that also creates some overdrive or distortion or whatever
Yep.
you call it, and that tends to be nice. But I don't know. Sometimes I make songs. Oh my god, my my English today. Songs that are meant to sound more natural. So maybe you don't want as much compression.
Mhm.
So it depends on
It
the song.
depends. It depends. That's always the answer. Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah. Let's go to the next thing here because you already mentioned it, Manel. Your the bane of your existence, the S's. No, S's and sibilants can be very difficult to get under control and to handle because it's, you know, every singer is different, and then if the combination of the mic and the voice is not ideal, or the mic position or whatever, they can be a pain to handle, and then processing can bring them up even more. So sibilance is part of making a vocal sit in the mix, because to me, if the S's sound unnatural, I always feel like it's a distraction and it just somehow doesn't sit well. And especially if it's too sibilant, and every time there's an S or a T or something like that, it just pops out of the mix like crazy. It also doesn't sit well in the mix. The S's need to work together with the rest of the top end of the mix, like to me and to most people. So when you think about where the S's are, there are cymbals, there might be transients in acoustic guitars, there might be a shaker or the percussion, but that's pretty much it. Like up there, above 10 kilohertz or so, especially up there, there's not much going on typically other than vocal sibilants, cymbals, and top-end heavy percussion stuff. And those things together create the percussive top end of the song. You can almost think about the vocal as a beatboxing thing that also has percussion in it. And it just needs to work. And if one of those things stands out too much, it just doesn't sit well. And so, since you've been on this journey and this like mission to, you know, defeat the S's once and for all these last couple of years, what are some of your learnings there that have worked for you? What are some things that haven't worked, or problems you ran into? Or just talk about your traumatic experience with S's, Manel.
I think we should make a T-shirt which says something like "I can see S's everywhere."
Yeah, but I have to say that part of the problem is me, because I'm overly sensitive to that, and every time I give Manel feedback on mixes, not anymore though, but there was a period where, I mean, occasionally it comes up, but there was a period where I always heard something wrong with the S's. And it's not just Manel, it's many mixes that I hear. I'm just very sensitive to that, and so I was kind of being a pain for Manel, but maybe it helped in some way. So share your experience with that, Manel.
Yeah, I think that the most useful thing in that regard is the positioning of the microphone, for me at least, right? I ended up tilting it like this. Yeah. I don't know if this is the microphone. Oh, yeah, this is only for YouTube viewers, but if this is the microphone and here's where you sing, then you put it a little bit like this and you sing like that, right?
Yeah.
So that helps a lot already. And of course, if you are the one singing, then you can also think about those things, like when you're singing, and try to, you know, when you have a big S, maybe you can move a little bit or something like that. And the same with the piece. What? Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just a child. You just said when you have a big ass, and then I stopped listening.
Oh my
S. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. All right.
So
wait.
mic
Yes.
positioning.
Yes. You can, if you know that about yourself, you can definitely move things around and react accordingly. Yeah. So mic positioning. What else? But what if you have something to work with that is still a little too sibilant, or maybe it was fine, but then after compression and EQ, it gets too sibilant.
Yeah. Well, then we have our friends, the de-essers. They are made to tame the S's.
Yeah.
So yeah, what I tend to do is to try to find the S's basically in. Oh my god, Benedict!
Sorry,
You're kidding me.
I'm trying to find the S's. I mean, who isn't, Manel? Who isn't? It's all of us, right? We're trying
I try to find where the frequencies where the S's are placed are in the EQ analyzer.
Yep.
And once I do that, then I use the de-esser to with that frequency and play with it, and yeah. And you can, as we do with everything, you can try to overdo it and see how overusing de-esser can destroy your vocals and everything. And once you know that, then you dial it back and until a normal place.
Yeah, agree. So de-essers, dynamic EQ, the typical, I think we have an entire episode on vocal sibilance, but just know that the sibilance is part of what makes it sit well in the mix. And yeah, these are some of the ways that we deal with S's. On to the next topic here. I can't even think straight anymore. No, but I think we got the point across. Our next thing is, and also, I think you mentioned it with overdoing it. This is very important here as well. If you overdo it and it starts to sound like a lisp, that's bad too. It's not that it has to be as smooth as possible. Like a natural S can be a little bit harsh in the mix, and it's like, it always depends. But when in doubt, I think it's better to have a slightly harsh sibilance than it is to have very weird, overprocessed lisping S's. So that's just better. Yeah. Next thing on my list here is effects. So now we should have a vocal that is EQ'd well, it is compressed properly and has volume automation. So in terms of levels and frequencies, it's just become a nice part of the mix. There's no excessive sibilance that's standing out. So, but it still will be pretty dry, and it will still not be glued into the mix really well, even if you did those things. So what can we do to help with that? There are some genres, of course, or some personal preference things where a really dry vocal is all you want and need, and that's fine. But even in those cases, a tiny little bit is usually applied to just make it part of the mix some more. And what you can do with effects are your most common tools for that would be reverbs, and there's different types of reverbs, and delays more than anything. You can also, of course, widen things, add like artificial doubles or like a micro shift effect or whatever. But like really, the most important tools here are reverb and delays. And so what do? We put the vocal in a space versus having it float on top of the mix super dry right in your face. We put it into a space where there's some ambience, some air around it, and it should, or it not, no, it does, it shouldn't. It can match the space that all the other instruments are in, or it can live in its own space, but it has to be intentional, and it's more often than not, it's not just right in your face without anything. Why I said there are different like types of reverb. So I always think of, and everyone's different, but the way that I think about it that helps me understand this and navigate a mixing session is that I always have like different types of reverb in my mixing session. And I think about it in terms of small to big. So I start with a very small, short type of reverb, which is a room, basically. It doesn't sound like a reverb tail. It's just the vocal being in a room all of a sudden and not really dry anymore. So it's very short reflections, just putting a little bit of ambience around it. That can be done with a reverb, like I said, or it can be done with a short stereo delay, which is what I prefer to do often because it's not cluttering the mix as much. So if you just add one echo left and one echo right, just whatever, 80 milliseconds on one side and like 120 or so on the other, like a slap delay with just one echo. This, if you blend that in slightly with the vocal, creates a little bit of width, creates these little like reflections left and right, and all of a sudden it sounds like, especially on headphones, it sounds like you're looking at the singer in front of you, and he or she is not right inside of your head anymore. And so that just puts it into the mix some more. And I often prefer that slap delay technique over a reverb, just because it doesn't clutter the mix as much. It's a little cleaner. It doesn't take up as much space. So that is one approach. Room reverb, like I said, is another one. Then we have larger rooms and reverbs that are more a matter of personal preference, genre, taste, and all that, more like an obvious effect and less about pushing the vocal into the mix. But they do push it back if you add more ambience around it, of course. So I would love to hear some of your go-tos, Manel, before I cover the entire topic again. Like, what are some go-to effects that you use and that help you make it sit better in the mix? I mean, I know that there are some that just are an effect and you want that sound of it, but what do you specifically do to help make the vocal become part of the mix some more?
Mm-hmm. I always have different reverbs set up in different basses for different things. Like I have a room reverb that I call the general room reverb, which I can send anything there. Like it's the general thing, general ambience of the song. Sometimes I only send a few things or maybe a lot of things, but just a tiny bit, right? Like, and then I have the lead vocal reverb. And also I normally have a micro pitch in a different bass and a slap back delay in a different bass. And those I use them pretty much every time, but you don't have to use them in a way that they are super noticeable. But I think that probably this is because, like with vocals, like the lead vocal, normally the main lead vocal, the main track tends to be super mono, right? Like, and I think adding the micro pitch on a bass and also the slap back delay thing makes it a little bit stereo. Like,
Yep,
just a little bit. It doesn't have to be something that you notice, and that makes it blend better, I guess, with the other elements. So yeah, that's mostly what I do, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. In general, like it's pretty simple with effects. I mean, it's not simple in that there are so many options, of course, but the general thing is the more you apply reverb or delays to a vocal, the further you push it back into the mix, the more ambient it becomes, the less upfront and close it sounds. It's like that's just the nature of it. And how much and what exactly you want to do depends on what you're trying to achieve. But I love what you said there, that you have different reverbs or effects for different purposes and different situations ready to go, and you can apply more or less ambience and reverb effect, but you can also apply things like the artificial stereo width with the micro shift and stuff, because that will connect the mono lead vocal more to what's on the sides. So if there's like stereo guitars and you add a little bit of that widening, and I would always blend it. I would not widen the vocal itself. Like it's good to have a mono lead vocal as your focal point, but you can blend in some widening or some artificial doubles or real doubles or any stereo information, because that will connect the guitars on the sides to the vocal some more, and it all becomes one. So it always depends on whether you want more or less separation. That's always also something we should mention. Maybe you want more separation and less glue, and then you obviously don't do those things. But if, it's always about being intentional and knowing what those do.
And you can also, which is some of the best things, which is using automation, right? Like, automation is the best thing ever.
Yeah, it is.
So with these things, you can use that. Like maybe you want to have a verse where the vocals are, for some reason, more isolated from the things, and then you turn up the micro shift in the choruses for whatever.
100%. And here's two things that I want to share when it comes to effects that are super important and that most people overlook, or at least in my experience, most inexperienced people. So one thing is you can not just EQ your vocals, you can also EQ the effects if you put them on a separate effects track, right? So if you don't put the reverb directly on the vocal track, but you put it on an effects track and you do a send and return configuration, which is the recommended way of doing reverbs and delays, then you can process the reverb individually of the dry vocal, which means you can, for example, just make the reverb much darker and tame the S's in the reverb, or you can tame the low end in the reverb, make it very mid-rangey, whatever you want to do, thinner, and that way you can separate the sound of the effect from the lead vocal, which means you can make the reverb sound more distant while keeping the vocal up front, and then you can add more reverb as an effect without sucking the vocal into the mix too much. So if you have a very obvious super bright reverb, that will kind of start fighting with the vocal. It can sound harsh. Everything's just still up front and nasty. But if you have a darker, lush, smooth-sounding reverb, you can have more of that, and it will not get in the way of the vocal, and the bright details in the vocal can still be there, and so you have best of both worlds, and you can play with that. So that's one thing. EQ your reverbs. You don't just have to make the vocal sit in the mix, you have to make the vocal effects sit in the mix as well. And if you just slap them on the vocal itself, it might not work, because if you have a really bright, modern, crispy, heavily compressed upfront vocal and you just put an effect on there with some preset and like delays and reverbs and whatever, it will be a pretty sibilant, bright mess likely. And so, yeah, you just have to figure out a way to make the reverb fit as well. So this is one thing, EQ your reverbs and delays. You can also compress those, by the way, which means if you compress them, you might be able to make them quieter but still audible. So the same principles apply to the effects themselves as to the vocals, and you can do that individually. Number 2 that I want to mention is there's a parameter on most reverbs that's called pre-delay. And that is super important because it determines the time between the dry vocal happening and the reverb kicking in, the reverb tail. So if you think about it, again, what happens in a big room, imagine you're standing in a really big hall or room and someone's standing next to you and they talk right next to you and you listen to them. So you hear the direct sound immediately because they're close to you. And then it takes a while for their voice to get to the walls, bounce back from the walls, and then get to you as reverb. So there is a distance between them right next to you and whatever comes back from the walls. This distance, this gap, is the pre-delay. So if there is a long, like a big pre-delay, it sounds like something is close to you, and you can have a lot of reverb, and the vocal will still sound close because our brain knows, oh, it takes a while before the reverb kicks in, so that must mean it's close and the walls are further away. So it makes the room sound a bit bigger, and it keeps the vocal close to you. If you remove the pre-delay or you don't add any, the reverb starts happening right when the vocal happens. And that would be someone standing close to the wall on the opposite side of that room, because then when they talk, it takes a while for their voice to get to your ear, and at the same time, the reflections will arrive at your ear because they're basically the same distance away. And that means if there's no pre-delay, and the vocal plus the reverb happen at the same time, our brain thinks, oh, they must be further away because I'm hearing them and the reflections at the same time. And so then the reverb becomes more part of the vocal. It will smear everything a little bit and it will sink the vocal into the mix. Both can be intentional. So if you want to push vocals into the mix more, remove the pre-delay, turn up the reverb. If you want to pull the vocal out of the mix but keep the effects, add some pre-delay, and all of a sudden you'll be able to use a lot of reverb and the vocal will still sound up front. So you can play with that parameter, and you should. And an alternative to that is you can also send the vocal to a delay and then send the delay to the reverb. So you're not even directly sending to a reverb. You can just send it to a delay, then the delay will go to the reverb, and then you have a natural kind of pre-delay built into your setup. There's all kinds of things you can play around with, but just know that once you disconnect the vocal from the reverb, it pulls it closer to you, and you will notice the reverb as its own thing behind the vocal. That's a very powerful concept to learn and wrap your head around. And then finally, before we wrap this up, you can create depth and distance between your different vocal layers with all those tools and techniques that we just mentioned. So you might have lead vocals, doubles, harmonies, backing vocals, all kinds of things, maybe happening at the same time, maybe not. Just know that you can also make a vocal or improve how a vocal sits in the mix by adding depth between those layers. So maybe you do everything you can to keep the lead vocal up front and close, but maybe you add less top end to your doubles, so the doubles will be a step behind the lead vocal. Maybe you make the harmonies even darker, and maybe you add more reverb to the harmonies, or maybe you have a pre-delay on the lead vocal but not on the doubles and harmonies, and so that way you can create a sense of depth between the vocal layers and make it not two-dimensional and flat sounding. And you can say, I want to position my lead vocals a little closer and everything else kind of behind it, or, these kinds of things. So you can apply different degrees and different ways of all the things we mentioned to different kinds of vocals, and that way create the whole that will be your mix. And yeah, an important concept again.
Yep.
Anything to add to that, Manel?
No, I mean, the only little thing to clarify is that every effect that I've mentioned before, I use it on a bass. Like, there's a bass where there's only a microshift effect. There's another bass where there's only a slapback delay effect and nothing else.
Yep.
So, yeah, just so you know that normally all the things that I do for this regard are effects placed on basses only for those effects.
Yeah, that's what I meant with effects tracks. And just to clarify for people, you are in Logic. That's why you call it buses, and it's correct to call it that way. But every DAW calls it differently. And so, if someone, for example, in Cubase, there would be effects tracks, and a bus would be a group. But in they are all buses. Every audio path that you can send things to is a bus. It's just that DAWs call it differently. But what it means is you have your own track with just the effect on it, whatever you want to call that track, and you send to that, and you blend the dry and the wet with those two different tracks. And in Logic, it's just buses. In Cubase, it's effects tracks. In some other DAW, it might be an aux track, whatever.
But buses is the right way, you mean, right?
It is. All of those are correct. All of those are correct. But it's always a bus. Yeah, whenever you send something anywhere and you can sum things together on a track like you can on your buses, then it's a bus. It's where.
Yeah, I think they could talk one day and just name the things the same way.
That would be nice.
Useful.
That would be very useful. Yeah, that's true for many areas of life.
Yeah.
People would just use the same language and terms. Yeah. Great. So please try these concepts. If you want to look up what we talked about, there's always a show notes page, by the way. You can go to the selfrecordingband.com/275. That is going to be the page with the show notes and a summary of what we talked about. That's true for every episode, just the selfrecordingband.com/number of the episode. And if you want to learn how all these things apply to your own music, and which kind of effects would be good for your song that you're working on, whether or not you're compressing enough, how to tame a certain sibilance problem you have, or whatever it is, if you're struggling with any of these things and you want help implementing what you just learned, you can go to the selfrecordingband.com, hit the apply button, fill out a short questionnaire, and what that does is you will apply for working with us one-on-one. And if we accept the application, we'll jump on a completely free call with you. We'll listen to your music. We talk to you about your goals, what you want to achieve, what you're struggling with. Then we create a custom plan for you. If you don't like that plan, we just part ways and you pay us nothing. If you like the plan, though, you can start working with us inside of our coaching program, the Self-Recording Syndicate, where we work alongside with you and walk you through everything you need to do to take your songs from wherever they are now to a finished, release-ready thing that you'll be proud of forever. This is what we do. And so if that sounds at all interesting to you, go to the selfrecordingband.com, hit the apply button. There's zero risk, and let's chat. All right. As always, talk to you next week on this podcast. Thank you so much for listening.
Goodbye, and thank you, and all of that.
Bye. Talk to you next week.